But I'm delighted to be here. I want to share a few thoughts on basically two aspects of the question of cultural diplomacy. One, sort of from a macro level, kind of general reflections, some of which have been points have been made, but I want to reiterate, and a couple of new ideas as well. And also, secondly, to talk a little bit about my personal experiences and reflections based on some work that I've done in the cultural diplomacy area. First of all, let me just start much the way that Undersecretary Glassman did at the outset with my working definition of public diplomacy. And that is in our case, in this context, the U.S. government's efforts to inform, influence, to understand, inform, and influence public opinion in support of U.S. foreign policy objectives. And I very much agree with the Undersecretary that it is linked in the final analysis, if we're talking about diplomacy as a national undertaking, it's got to be linked to the advancement of U.S. foreign policy interests. I very much agree with that point of view. In that sense, cultural diplomacy is a subset of public diplomacy. It's not the whole of it, but it's an important part. And in cultural diplomacy, we're using culture, as has been defined both by Mr. Glassman and by others, as a vehicle for advancing America's national interest. At the outset, I also want to note that I think while there is, in fact, in my view, a lot of kind of ambiguity about what the goals and the proper goals of U.S. public diplomacy really are. I think there are four categories of objectives that I think probably all of us in this room can agree on. And I would list them in kind of an ascending order of perhaps difficulty and also desirability from the standpoint of the U.S. Government, let's say. Number one, I think we can all agree public diplomacy is about getting people to understand us. Whether or not you like us, whether or not you agree with our policies on human rights or WTO or Sudan or anything else, at least if you can understand where we're coming from, I think that's an important step forward. I think the next thing, and the next rung, if you will, on the ladder is to get people to like us. Now, one can say, well, maybe you can understand us but not like us, you can like us but not understand us. But be that as it may, when peoples like the United States, good things happen for our country and fewer bad things happen to Americans overseas and here in the homeland. So having people like us, I think, is an objective. And the third one, perhaps most importantly, and here I again amplify the point that Undersecretary Glassman made, we want foreign nations to support us in our foreign policies. That's the bottom line with public diplomacy as a government enterprise. We want people to vote our way at the United Nations. We want people to support our position on WTO or Afghanistan or human rights in any number of countries and so on. And so this idea of supporting us is important. That's really the objective, the end of U.S. public diplomacy. And I would add a fourth one that we sometimes don't talk about, and in fact that sometimes U.S. leaders disavow. But I think it's real. And I think the reality is, right or wrong, and I'm not drawing a judgment, I think we in the United States want the world to look a little bit more like us. Let's be honest. We'd like to see a whole bunch of countries in the world that govern the way we govern, run economics the way we do in terms of the market, have the kind of pluralism that we do, have the kind of vibrant civil society that we do. You know, and we'll feel safer and more secure if there are a lot of countries in the world that look more like the United States. We often, sometimes at the presidential and leadership level, disavow that, but the fact is I think that's a strain. Now, underneath this discussion of cultural diplomacy, I think there are three underlying assumptions, and I want to just draw those out. Number one, that culture broadly defined is an expression of America's core ideals and who we are, and that through culture we can lead someone overseas to an understanding of what we are and who we are as a nation. The second assumption is that, and this has been alluded to in previous comments, that there is such a universal and powerful appeal to the ideas that are at the heart of our nation that once we introduce someone to that culture, the likelihood is, and the desired outcome is, that they're going to come around to our point of view, that they're going to view the world the way that we do. And so by exposing foreign citizens to our culture, the idea is that they will see the world much as we do and kind of understand that we're right. That's an assumption, I think, in this kind of activity. And the third assumption, which stems from the other two, is that when we talk about cultural diplomacy as a national undertaking, as a government undertaking, as an activity of government, then what we're suggesting is that the government, our government, can make a difference in how people see and view the United States and react to the United States through using culture. And I would just note, and this could be a long side discussion. In fact, I thought it would be, so I devoted an hour to it. But um, uh, but the point that I would make is the first assumption I think is true, and I think is eternal. That is that culture is a way to the heart of America and any country. The second assumption I think is questionable now. The assumption that was at the core of our efforts in the Cold War was that if we could just talk to everybody behind the Iron Curtain, they'd get it that we're right. And guess what? That pretty much was the case in that context. But today we're operating in a different context, and I'll talk about that. So I'm not sure that question of universality is, or that assumption is still accurate. To put it this way, I think we're still operating, we as a nation, in terms of our public diplomacy outreach on the basis of a Francis Fukuyama end of history assumption rather than a Samuel Huntington clash of civilizations assumption. And I think there needs to be some retooling of how we look at public diplomacy as a construct. The third assumption as to whether the government can make a difference in this area and set the cultural agenda, I think it is self-evident to all of us that that is no longer true if it was. And I think it was truer 40 or 50 or 60 years ago, in say 1949, than it is today when culture now flows fast and freely across obliterated national boundaries via YouTube, Google, and the internet, and CDs and movies and pirated discs and so on and so forth. And the fact is, as the student here in the back made the point, and as others have said, we're a pebble in the ocean, and we, the U.S. government, and the U.S. government really can't have a very significant impact, in my judgment, in this area because there's so many other waves crashing out there. Now, the world has changed in a couple of ways, obviously, with respect to the question of cultural diplomacy. I think back to Dr. Billington, Dr. James Billington, the current Librarian of Congress and a great Russia scholar, who eloquently and aptly characterized the end of the Cold War as the triumph of a great story over a great theory. One of the great encapsulations I've ever heard of that period of history. And this notion of the story is what cultural diplomacy is really about. As many of us know, and I see many friends from the old USIA days and so on, this notion of telling America's story is what cultural diplomacy really is about. But the context in which we're telling that story has fundamentally changed. As has been noted, it is no longer a US-USSR superpower, a bipolar world. And that has a number of implications. For one, and relatedly, in 1945 or 1949 or 52, the United States was pretty much, in the eyes of everyone except the Soviet bloc, the good guys in the world, because we'd after all, saved the world from the Nazis, or certainly contributed an enormous effort to that. Along with our allies. Today, the backdrop in terms of American policy and America's posture in the world is much more complex and nuanced than it was. So that's one difference. At that time, there was a yearning and a hunger and a burning thirst for cultural content that we could provide in the Soviet bloc in particular. Today, even in Russia, which is not quite as far along the democratic path as many would hope at this point, many years after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, even there, it is possible to access all kinds of American culture, so too in China, so too all around the world. And so we're not dealing in that tight vacuum in which we were before. And so the desirability of our product is not what it was in 1949 or 56. That's another change. And I think that all of these things, of course, the internet, it goes without saying, has incinerated national borders and made culture slosh around the world to a degree that has never before been known. Now, in fact, the very proceedings that we're participating in right now will be able to be seen in Riyadh, Mexico City, Moscow, Beijing, and everything else. So that's a very significant development. And so, in short, the whole context of cultural diplomacy, I think, right now is very different than what it was, and I think we have to grapple with that and recalibrate our thinking about what cultural diplomacy is, what it can be, and how we engage in it. Secondly, and sort of to close, I want to just share a few personal observations. Rob Albro had asked me to say a little bit about the work that I did when I was overseas. I spent 5 years in China and 4 years in Russia, and they were very gratifying and challenging tours of duty. Uh, and I found that in my experience, um, the kind of thing that really gets across and makes a difference to people has three components to it. It's got to be organic, it's got to be personal, and it's got to be emotional. Let me just say a quick word on these and then I'll specify what I mean. Organic. As the Undersecretary mentioned earlier, you can't just stand at the lectern in a lecture or, in his word, preach. You've got to be taking part in public discourse on the terms of the society and the country in which you're operating. If you're not doing that, frankly, you're not relevant. And to do that, to some degree, you have to have the language capacity and so on, but also the cultural context. I've been a deputy spokesman. John Brown and I served at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. I was a deputy spokesman of our embassy there. Dealt a lot with the press. You know, you can read talking points about WTO accession and about Sudan and Afghanistan and Kosovo and whatever the issue of the day is, but it's very difficult to connect. And we all understand, and studies over and over have shown you can't really change minds at the level of intellectual argument. That's why our own political discourse is rarely about intellectual argument, and that's true around the world. And I don't mean that to sound as harsh as it may, but you can change hearts, and you can change minds via the heart. And I think that we have to think about ways to personalize and hit an emotional chord with our audiences. So that's very important. And what I tried to do to sort of bring those strands together, and I'll just briefly mention it before concluding, is, and I'm confident I'll get some snickers and chuckles, but I found that using contemporary American country music as a way of accessing and discussing key, believe it or not, policy issues, but also aspects and strands in American society was one of the most effective things that I personally did in my 9 years overseas in China and Russia. I've had the privilege of being able to speak to groups representing about 1/3 of the countries of the world, many, many thousands of people live in rooms like this, particularly in China, in Russia, Vietnam, and other countries, and here in the United States. And I've been stunned at how consistent the reaction to the music has been again and again across cultural boundaries. Why country? Very quickly, because it's uniquely American, because it now has a pop sensibility that makes it accessible to young people, because it has a lyrical content, unlike jazz, and a much more diverse lyrical content than the blues by definition, which focus on one type of feeling. And that lyrical content accesses aspects of American life and opens up a dialogue on all kinds of things that you wouldn't imagine you could be talking to Vietnamese, Chinese, or Russians about. Also, the lyrics are intelligible. You can understand them. You can hear someone singing and tell a story and know what they're saying. And finally, the values and the themes that come through country music are both universal, and I'll say a word about that, and also, if I can put it this way, family friendly. There's a lot of pop music, pop, rock, hard rock, rap, hip hop, and so on, where some of us would blush to listen to some of those lyrics with our parents in the room, for example. Country music is not like that. And it's respectful of those sensibilities, and it talks about family. It talks about country, loving one's country, and more than any other topic other than love and love gone wrong. And it does talk about that. It talks about God. And I so want to echo Helly's excellent point about religion. I've been an outlier in my career in the State Department, Foreign Service, because I always talk about God. I always, and I'm Jewish. I talk about God. I talk about faith. I once gave a presentation where, to my own surprise, I said overseas and to a foreign audience, I sin every day. I said that. And I have to tell you, of all the things I've said about WTO and Sudan, that's the thing that resonated with people. That's the thing where people looked at me, and you know how you have that look sometimes as a speaker, where you know, it's exactly the opposite of what I've got now, by the way, where you know that you're connecting with people. Well, I had that moment. And so my point is, absolutely, I echo the point about religion. I'm an outlier, but you're absolutely right. It's something we don't know. Let me just close by saying I hope we can take up some more topics in question and answer. And I think culture is an exceedingly powerful force in shaping perceptions of the United States of America and all countries. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, by the way. And I'm talking even about pop culture. And finally, I think in this new age, we need to do a better job understanding the opportunities and potential and limitations associated with cultural diplomacy. And I salute American University and all our sponsors for holding this event. Thank you very much for the opportunity.